Continuing where I last left off, Chapter 7. Toward evening, when Elegin took leave of them, Nikolai, finding that they were still far from home, accepted it, uncle's offer that hunting party should spend the night in his little village of Mikhailovka, and if you would put up at my house a fair field, a clear course, then so much the better, he said. You see, the weather's damp. You could rest, and the little countess could be driven back in a gig. His offer was accepted, and a huntsman was sent to Otranon for the gig, while Nikolai, Natasha, and Petya rode to Uncle's house. Some half-dozen male domestic serfs, big and little, rushed out to the front porch to meet their master. A score of women serfs of every age and size popped out at the back entrance to have a look at the huntsmen who were arriving. The appearance of Natasha, a woman, a lady on horseback, aroused their curiosity to such a pitch that many of them went up to her, stared her into her face, and, unabashed by her presence, made remarks about her as though she were some prodigy on show and not a human being who could hear and understand what was said about her. Arinka, look now, she sits sideways, sits with her skirt dangling, and look at the little horn. Holy saints, and that knife! A regular Tartar! How is it you didn't tumble head over heels? Asked the boldest of them, addressing Natasha directly. Uncle dismounted at the steps of his little wooden house, which was buried in the midst of an overgrown garden, and looking over his household, peremptorily shouted to those who were not needed to take themselves off, and told the others to see the necessary preparations for the guest and the visiting huntsman. The serfs all dispersed. Uncle lifted Natasha off her horse, and taking her hand, led her up to the rickety plank steps of the porch. Inside, with its bare, unplastered timber walls, the house was not very clean. It did not look as if those living in it aimed to keep it spotless, but neither was it noticeably neglected. In the entry, there was a smell of fresh apples, and the walls were hung with the skins of wolves and foxes. Uncle led his guest through the vestibule into a little hall with a folding table and red chairs, then into a drawing room with a sofa and a round birchwood table, and from there into his study, where there was a tattered sofa, a threadbare carpet, and portraits of Suvorov, of his father and mother, and of himself in the military uniform. The study smelled strongly of tobacco and dogs. After asking his guests to sit down and make themselves at home, Uncle left the room. Rugai, his back still muddy, came in, lay down on the sofa. Petya leaned on his elbow and fell asleep at once. Natasha and Nikolai sat without speaking. Their faces glowed, and they were very hungry and very gay. They looked at each other, now that the hunt was over, and they were in the house. Nikolai was no longer considered it necessary to show his manly superiority over his sister. Natasha winked at her brother, and neither of them could refrain for long from bursting into peals of laughter, even before they had any pretext for their mirth. After a while, Uncle came in wearing a Cossack coat, blue trousers, and little top boots, and Natasha felt that this garb, which she had regarded with surprise and amusement when Uncle had worn it at the Ultranon, was the perfect costume, and in no way inferior to a swallowtail or frock coat. Uncle was too high in spirits and, far from taking offense at the brothers' and sisters' laughter, It would never have to enter his head that they were laughing at his way of life, joined in their spontaneous merriment. "Well, this young countess, Fairfield, clear course, never saw anything like her," he said, giving Nikolai a long-stemmed pipe and with a practiced motion of 3 fingers filling another, one that had been cut short, for himself. "She's been in the saddle all day. Be enough for any man, and looks as if nothing had happened." Soon after Uncle's reappearance, the door was open. Judging from the sound by a barefooted servant girl and a stout, rosy, handsome woman of about 40, with a double chin and full red lips, entered carrying a large, loaded tray. She looked at the visitors, her eyes in every moment expressing a dignified, cordial welcome, and with a genial smile, bowed respectfully. Despite her exceptional stoutness, which obliged her to hold her head back with her bosom and stomach protruding, this woman, she was Uncle's housekeeper, moved with an extraordinary light step. She went to the table and set down the tray, her plump white hands deftly arranging the bottles, the various hors d'oeuvres and other delicacies. When she had finished, she stepped back to the door and stood there with a smile on her face. "Here I am she. Now, do you understand, Uncle?" her attitude seemed to say to Rostov. How could one help understanding? Not only Nikolai, but even Natasha understood his happy, complacent smile, his furrowed brow and puckered lips when Anisia Fyodorova entered. On the tray were various liquors, herb, brandy, mushrooms, rye cakes, made with buttermilk, honey in the comb, both still and sparkling mead, apples, raw and roasted nuts, and honey and nut confections. Later, Anisia Fyodorova brought in a freshly roasted chicken, ham, and preserves made with honey and with sugar. All this was the work of her own hands, gathered and prepared by her, and all was redolent of Anisia Fyodorova's herself, smacking of succulence, cleanliness, milkiness, and genial smiles. "Try some of this, little lady countess," she kept saying, as she offered Natasha first one thing, then another. Natasha ate everything, and thought she had never seen or tasted such buttermilk cakes, such savory preserves, such honey and nut confections, or such chicken anywhere. Anisiasa Fyodorova withdrew. After supper, over cherry brandy, Rostov and Uncle talked of past and future hunts, of Rogai and of Iligin's dogs. Natasha sat upright on the sofa, listening to them with sparkling eyes. She tried several times to rouse Petya and make him eat something, but he only muttered incoherently without waking up. Natasha felt so elated and happy in these novel surroundings that her only fear was that the gig might come for her too soon. After one of those casual silences that inevitably occur when one is entertaining friends for the first time in one's own house, Uncle, responding to the thought that was in his visitor's mind, said, "So you see how I'm ending my days. Death must come, Fairfield, clear course, and nothing will remain. So why sin?" Uncle's face was very expressive and even handsome as he said this. Rostov found himself recalling how his father and all the neighbors always had nothing but good to say of Uncle. Throughout the whole district he had the reputation of being the most honorable and disinterested of all of codgers. They called him in to arbitrate family disputes, choose him as executor, and confided their secrets to him. He had been elected a justice among other posts, but had always stubbornly refused all public appointments, spending the autumn and spring in the fields on his bay gelding, the winter sitting at home, and the summer lounging in his overgrown garden. Why don't you enter the service, uncle? I was in the service, but gave it up. Not fit for it. Can't make head or tail of it. That's for you. I haven't the brains for it. Now hunting, that's another matter. A fair field and clear course. Open the door there, he shouted. Why have you shut it? The door at the end of the corridor, which word Uncle pronounced corridor, led to the hunter's room, as they called the room for the hunt servants. There was a rapid patter of bare feet, and an unseen hand opened the door into the hunter's room. From the corridor came the clear sounds of balakia being played by someone who was unmistakably a master. Natasha had been listening to the music for some time now and went out into the passage to hear it better. That Mitka, my coachman. I bought him a good balakia. I like it, said Uncle. It was the custom for Mitka to play the balakia in the hunter's room when Uncle returned from the chase. Uncle loved to listen to this music. How well he plays! It's really very nice, said Nikolai with a certain unconscious superciliousness, as if ashamed to admit that the music pleased them very much. Nice, exclaimed Natasha reproachfully in response to her brother's tone. Nice isn't the word. It's absolutely enchanting. Just as Uncle's mushrooms, honey, and liquors had seemed to her the most delicious in the world, so this song at that moment seemed to her to be the very acme of music delight. Again, please, again, said Natasha at the door as soon as the music had ceased. Mika turned up and again began strumming Mistress Mine, plucking and flourishing out the note. Uncle sat listening with his head on one side, a faint smile on his lips. The air of Mistress Mine was repeated 100 times. The balakia was returned more than once, after which the same notes were strummed again. But the listeners did not grow weary of it, and only wished to hear it again and again. Anisia Fyodorovna came in and leaned her portly person against the doorpost. Please listen to him now, little countess, she said to Natasha, with a smile remarkably like Uncle's. He really can play, Art Mitka, she said. He doesn't get that part right, said Uncle suddenly, with a vigorous gesture. It ought to be rippled out there. Fair field, clear course, rippled out. Then you know how to play, asked Natasha. Uncle smiled, but did not answer. Anashushka, have a look and see if the strings of my guitar are all right, will you? Haven't touched it for some time. Fair field, clear course. I've given it up. Anisia Fyodorovna readily went off with her light step to do her master's bidding and brought back the guitar. Without looking at anyone, Uncle blew the dust off the guitar, tapped the sounding board with his bony fingers, tuned up and settled back in his armchair, croaking his left arm in a rather theatrical gesture. He took the guitar above the fingerboard and with a wink at Anisia Fyodorovna struck a single pure, sonorous chord, then smoothly, quietly, but confidently began playing in a very slow tempo, not Mistress Mine, but the well-known song, Came a Maiden Dawn Down the Street. The hearts of Nikolai and Natasha thrilled in time with the measured gaiety of the song, that same measured gaiety which radiated from Anisia Fyodorovna's whole being. Anisia Fyodorovna blushed, and, hiding her face in her handkerchief, went laughing out the room. Uncle went on with his flawless, painstaking, vigorous playing of the song, all the while gazing with a transfigured, inspired expression at the spot where Anisia Fyodorovna had stood. A faint smile lurked at one corner of his mouth under the gray mustache, broadening as the song went on and the tempo quickened, and in places where he played a flourish, he snapped the strings. Lovely, lovely, Uncle. Again, again, cried Natasha as soon as he had finished, and jumping up she hugged and kissed him. Nikolenka, Nikolenka, she said, turning to her brother in wonder. Nikolai too was delighted with Uncle's playing, and the song was played once more. Anisia Fyodorova's smiling face appeared in the doorway, and behind her other faces. Fetching water at the spring, stay, dear maid, he cried. Uncle played again, and after another light flourish broke off with a twitch of his shoulders. Oh, go on, Uncle darling, wailed Natasha imploringly, as if her life depended on it. Uncle stood up, and it was as if there were two men in him at that moment, one gravely smiling at the other, the merry fellow, while the merry fellow took a naive and formal pose preliminary to the dance. Now then, little niece, he cried, waving to Natasha with the hand that had just struck a chord. Natasha flung off her shawl, ran forward to stand facing Uncle, and with the arms akimbo and a quick movement of her shoulders struck an attitude. When, where, and how had this young countess, educated by a French emigrant governess, imbibed with the Russian air, she breathed the spirit of the dance? Where had she picked up that matter, which the pas de chel, one might have supposed, would long ago have obliterated? But the spirit of the movements were those inimitable, unteachable Russian gestures that Uncle had expected of her. The moment she struck her pose and smiled that proud, triumphant, knowing smile, the fear that had at first seized Nikolai and the others, that she might not do the right thing, passed, and they were already admiring her. Her performance was so perfect, so absolutely perfect, that Anisia Fyodorova, who had instantly handed her the kerchief she needed for the dance, had tears in her eyes, though she laughed as she watched this slender, grateful countess, who was able to understand all that was in Anisia, and in Anisia's father and mother and aunt, and in every Russian man and woman. Well, little countess, fair field, clear course, cried Uncle, laughing with delight, when the dance was over. Well done, niece. Now all we need is to pick out a fine young fellow for your husband. Fair field, clear course. One has already been picked out, said Nikolai, smiling. Oh, said Uncle in surprise, looking inquiringly at Natasha, who nodded her head with a happy smile. And such a fine one, she said. And as soon as she had said it, a new train of thoughts and feelings arose in her. What did Nikolai's smile mean when he said already picked out? Is he glad or sorry? He seems to think my Bukowski would not understand or approve of such a gaiety. But he would understand everything. Where is he now, she wondered, and her face suddenly grew serious. However, this lasted only a second. Don't think about it. Don't you dare think about it, she told herself, and, smiling again, sat down beside Uncle and asked him to play something more. Uncle played another song and a waltz. Then, after a pause, he cleared his throat and sang his favorite hunting song. When fell at eventide winter's first lovely snow, Uncle sang as peasant sings, with the full and naive conviction that the whole meaning of a song lies in the words, that the tune comes of self and exists only to give measure into the verse, apart from which it is nothing. Consequently, this unconsidered tune, like the song of a bird, had an extraordinary charm. Natasha was in ecstasies over Uncle's singing. She decided to give up her harp lessons and play only the guitar. She asked Uncle for his guitar and at once picked out the chords of the song. About 10 o'clock, a wagonette, a droshky, and 3 men on horseback who had been sent to look after them arrived to fetch Natasha and Petya. The Count and Countess did not know where they were and how, and had been very anxious, so one of the men said, Petya was carried out like a corpse and laid in the wagonette. Natasha and Nikolai got into the droshky. Uncle wrapped up Natasha and said goodbye to her with a new tenderness. He accompanied them on foot as far as the bridge, which could not be crossed, so they had to ford the stream, and he sent men to ride in front of them with lanterns. Farewell, dear little niece, his voice called out of the darkness, not the voice that Natasha had known before, but the one that had sung When Fell at Eventide. In the village through which they drove there were red lights and a cheerful smell of smoke. What a darling that uncle is, said Natasha when they had come out into the highway. Yes, Nikolai said. You're not cold? No, I'm quite all right. I feel so happy, said Natasha, positively puzzled by her feelings. They remained silent for a long while. The night was dark and damp. They could not see the horses, but only heard them splash through the unseen mud. What was passing in that childlike, receptive soul that so eagerly caught and assimilated all the diverse impressions of life? How did they all find place in her? But she was very happy, as they were nearing home, and she suddenly began to hum the air when fell at eventide, which she had been trying to recapture all the way, and at last had succeeded in remembering. Got it? Asked Nikolai. What were you thinking about just now, Nikolenka? They were fond of asking each other this question. I, responded Nikolai, trying to remember. Well, you see, first I was thinking that Rugai, the red dog, was like Uncle, and that if he were a man, he would keep up Uncle near him all the time. If not for hunting for harmony. He really is a harmonious fellow. Don't you think so? Well, and you? Wait a minute. Wait. Yes, first I thought that here we are driving along and imagining that we are going home. But God knows where we are going in the darkness. And all of a sudden we shall arrive and find we are not the Ultranome, but in fairyland. And then I thought, no, that was all. I know you were probably thinking of him, said Nikolai, smiling, as Natasha could tell by the sound of his voice. No, Natasha replied, though in fact she had been thinking of Prince Andrei at the same time, and of how he would have liked Uncle. And then I kept saying to myself all the way, how beautifully Anayushka carried herself, how beautifully. And Nikolai heard spontaneous ringing, happy laugh. And you know, she suddenly said, I am sure I shall never again be as happy, as at peace I am now. As I am now. That's absurd. Don't be silly, said Nikolai, and he thought, what a darling this Natasha of mine is. I have never had any, never shall be a friend like her. Why does she have to get married? I could drive like this with her forever. What a darling this Nikolai of mine is, Natasha was thinking. Ah, there are still lights in the drawing room, she said, pointing to the windows of the house which gleam inevitably in the wet, velvety darkness of night. Chapter 8. Count Yalovich Andrich had resigned the office of Marshal of the Nobility because it involved him in too much expense. But still, his affairs did not improve. Nikolai and Natasha often found their parents engaged in secret, anxious consultations, and heard talk of selling the sumptuous Rostov ancestral house and the estate near Moscow. Now that the Count was no longer Marshal of the Nobility, it was not necessary to entertain so extensively, and they led a quieter life at Otradon than in former years. But still, the enormous house and the lodges were full of people, and more than 20 sat down to table every day. These were all their own people who had settled in the house and were almost members of the family, or those who were obliged, it seemed, to live in the Count's house. Such were Dimmler the musician and his wife Vogel the dancing master and his family Bailova, an elderly spinster who had made her home there, and many others such as Petya's tutors, the girl's former governess, and various people who simply found it preferable or more to their advantage to live at the Count's house than at home. There were not so many visitors as before, but their way of life remained the same, for the Count and Countess could not conceive of any other. There was still the hunting establishment, which Nikolai had even enlarged, with 50 horses and 15 grooms in their stables. The same costly gifts and gala dinner parties, to which the whole district was invited on 9 name days. Still the Count's whist in Boston, at which, holding his cards so everyone could see them, he let himself be divested of hundreds of rubles every day by his neighbors, who looked upon the privilege of a game with Count Ilya Andrich as a profitable source of income. The Count proceeded in his affairs as if moving about in a huge net, trying not to believe he was trapped, but becoming more and more entangled at every step, and feeling that it was beyond his strength to rend the web that ensnarled him, or carefully and patiently to disentangle the strands. The Countess, with her loving heart, feeling that her children were being ruined, but that the Countess was not to blame, for he could not help being what he was, and that he himself was suffering, though he tried to conceal it from the consciousness of his own and his children's ruin, try to find some means of remedying the situation. From her feminine point of view, she could see only one solution, for Nikolai to marry a wealthy heiress. She felt that this was their last hope, and that if he were to refuse the match she had found for him, she would have to relinquish all hope of ever restoring their fortunes. This match was with Julie Karagina, the daughter of fine, upright parents, a girl the Rostovs had known from childhood, and now, because of the death of the last of his brothers, heiress to a large fortune. The Countess had written to Julia's mother in Moscow, suggesting a marriage between their children, and had received a favorable answer. Julie's mother had replied that for every part she was ready to consent to the match, but that everything would depend on her daughter's inclinations. She invited Nikolai to come to Moscow. On several occasions, with tears in her eyes, the Countess had told her son that now the both of her daughters were settled. Her only wish was to see him married. She said she could go to her grave content if this were accomplished. Then, saying that she had an excellent girl in mind, she would try to elicit his views on matrimony. At other times, she praised Julie to him and advised Nikolai to go to Moscow for the holidays and amuse himself. Nikolai guessed what his mother's remarks were leading up to, and in one of these conversations urged her to speak frankly. She told him that her only hope of rectifying their affairs now laid in his marrying Julie. "But, Maman, suppose I love a girl with no fortune. Would you really expect me to sacrifice my feelings and my honor for the sake of money?" he asked his mother, unconscious of the cruelty of his question and simply wishing to show his own integrity. "No, you have not understood me," said his mother, not knowing how to justify herself. "You have not understood me, Nikolenka. It is your happiness I want," she added, feeling that she was not telling the truth and was becoming confused. She began to cry. "Mamma, dear, don't cry. Only tell me that you wish it, and you know I will give my life, anything for the peace of mind," said Nikolai. "I would sacrifice everything for you, even my feelings." But the Countess did not want the question put like that. She did not want a sacrifice from her son. She would sooner have sacrificed herself for him. "No, you don't understand me. Let's not talk about it," she said, wiping away her tears. "And perhaps I really do love a poor girl," Nikolai said to himself. "Am I to sacrifice my feelings and my honor for money? I wonder how Mama could suggest such a thing to me. Because Sonia is poor, I must not love her, must not respond to her faithful, devoted love. And I should certainly be happier with her than with some doll like Julie. I cannot command my feelings," he said to himself. "If I love Sonia, that feeling is stronger and higher than all else for me." Nikolai did not go to Moscow, and the Countess did not renew her conversations with him about marriage. But she saw with sorrow, and sometimes with exasperation, the signs of a growing attachment between her son and the dowerless Sonia. And though she reproached herself for it, she could not refrain from grumbling and nagging at Sonia, often calling her my dear, and using the formal you instead of the intimate thou when speaking to her. What irritated the kind-hearted Countess more than anything was that this poor, dark-eyed niece of hers was so meek, so good, so devotedly grateful to her benefactors, and so faithfully, constantly, and unselfishly in love with Nikolai that there were no grounds for finding fault with her. Nikolai spent the remainder of his leave with his parents. A fourth letter had come from Prince Andrei in Rome, in which he wrote that he would have been on his way back to Russia long ago had not his wound unexpectedly opened the warm climate, which obliged him to defer his return to the beginning of the new year. Natasha was as much in love with her betrothed as ever, was still as tranquil in her love, still as responsive to all the joys of life. But by the end of the 4th month of their separation, she began to have fits of depression against which she was unable to contend. She felt sorry for herself, sorry that she was being wasted all this time and of no use to anyone, while feeling that she had such a capacity for loving and being loved. Life was not gay in the Rostov house. Chapter 9. Christmas came, and except for the ceremonial mass, the solemn and wearisome congratulations to neighbors and house serf, and the new dresses everyone put on, there was nothing special to mark the holidays. Though the still weather, with the thermometer at 13 degrees below zero, the bright, dazzling sunshine by day, and the starlit sky at night seemed to call for some celebration of the season. On the 3rd day of Christmas week, all the household dispersed to various rooms after dinner. It was the dullest time of the year. Nikolai, who had been calling on neighbors in the morning, was asleep in the sitting room. The old count was resting in his study. Sonia sat at the round table in the drawing room copying a design for embroidery. The countess was paying patience. Natasha Ivanovna, the buffoon, with a woe-begone countenance, sat at the window with 2 old ladies. Natasha came into the room, went up to Sonia, and glanced at what she was doing, then crossed to her mother and stood without speaking. "Why are you wandering about like a homeless spirit?" asked her mother. "What is it you want?" "I want him. Now, this minute, I want him," said Natasha, her eyes glittering and without a trace of a smile. The countess raised her head and gave her daughter a searching look. "Don't look at me, Mama. Don't look at me or I'll start crying." "Sit down. Come and sit here by me," said the countess. "Mama, I want him. Why should I be wasted like this, Mama?" Her voice broke, and the tears gushed from her eyes. To hide them, she quickly turned away and left the room. She went to the sitting room, stood there a moment, lost in thought, then went to the maid's room. There, an elderly housemaid was scolding a young girl who stood before her, panting, having just run in and out of the cold from the serf's quarter. "Enough now, no more playing," said the old woman. "There's a time for everything." "Let her be, Kontradevneva," said Natasha. "Go, Marusha, go." And having dismissed Marusha, Natasha crossed the ballroom and went to the vestibule, where an old footman and 2 young